Good evening and welcome. My name is Paul George. I'm Director of Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Glad to see you all here this evening. I'm sure you know Robert Scheer's credentials. During the 60s, he was the editor-in-chief and one of the original reporters for the almost legendary Ramparts magazine. Then he spent 17 years as national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, during which time he interviewed people you might recognize by the name of Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter. He's responsible for the famous Jimmy's "I Lusted in My Heart" interview. Yeah, breakthrough in American journalism. Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, among others. So he's met and talked with and interviewed power directly. In 1993, he launched a syndicated column from the Los Angeles Times, which ran for many, many years until he moved it over to Truthdig.com, where he serves as editor-in-chief and where his column appears every week on Tuesdays, usually. Truthdig has won many Webby Awards year after year for Best Political Site, so check it out, truthdig.com. But perhaps the most important credential that he comes with us today is that he is mentoring a new generation of journalists through his work and his teaching at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at USC, where he teaches the students about long-form journalism, political journalism, and public policy. And I'm looking forward to getting mentored by Robert Scheer myself. Once again, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Robert Scheer.
Thanks for having me. I get a weird feeling when I come here. I've been here 4 times?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the middle of that, I had 2 open heart surgeries, so it sort of jinxes me. But I go on. No, actually, I did want to come this time because, first of all, it's the center of the whole invasion of our privacy here in the... I got lost on El Camino, and I thought, yeah, I know all these addresses, and so forth. And it sort of does go to the heart of the subject. But I also, it's a subject I'm exploring. I think the other times I spoke about the weapons industry and arms control. And I have my book on the economy. I could speak about those things with greater confidence. I'm still exploring the whole question of surveillance, but not only am I exploring it, but the world's population is exploring it thanks to Edward Snowden. You know, I keep reading, you know, people like Dianne Feinstein, who was the head of the Intelligence Committee, and, you know, Jane Harman, who was the House Intelligence Committee, and they, on the one hand, they blast Snowden as some kind of traitor and treasonous and so forth, and then they go on to discuss issues and call for investigations that we wouldn't be having if not for Edward Snowden. So I have to say I consider him one of the great patriots in American history, and I think he will be acknowledged as such. I don't think there's any question. And actually, I to this day, I haven't seen any information that we didn't have a right to have. That's the part I don't even get in this whole discussion. You know, what is it we're not supposed to have? So let me explain my own connection with this issue and how even for all of that I was so surprised it would come out. I got involved with the whole issue of privacy and surveillance in something of an academic sense when I first went to USC, which was in the middle of the 90s. And I started a privacy center. I was editing some online journalism review, and I was intrigued by the connection between the new technology and emerging world economy, and what was this doing to how we are and who we are and how society work. And I remember at that time I was, actually a bit earlier, I had been doing a lot of journalism with the beginning of the internet. And I remember the first time one time I tried to do all my work online, so to speak, and I used the Stanford-Moscow hookup that existed and sent my story back. Instead of using the old telex machine, sent it back by 300 baud. It was very exciting. And then you'd, of course, get on the phone and ask the people on the other end if they actually got it, and you could see the words on that green screen, phosphorin. And it was all terrific stuff. Well, we all know what's happened. I now, as mentioned, by the way, Ramparts, when I first went to work for it, I believe was on this street, but somewhere in Menlo Park. It's so depressing. They all look alike every time I've tried to find the building. Unfortunately, we moved up to San Francisco just before I would go crazy from the commute. But we did start here. We had a wonderful guy, Ed Keating, who was the original publisher and was a Catholic literary quarterly, and they were all excited about Pope John and was inspired, and that's how Ramparts started, right up the street. But at any rate, Ramparts, and it was a terrific publication. If Ramparts in a month reached as many people as we reach in one day on Truthdig, it would be quite startling. We can, one of the things, as we all know, on the internet we can track who comes and how far do they read, and we've been able to demolish some myths, one of which is that people don't want to read or that they don't read long pieces. It's not true. On the internet, I am grateful when Chris Hedges writes for us, which he does every Monday. I wish he would go on for 20 jumps. It does wonders for our traffic. Fact is, the stuff is stolen by everybody in the world, and then when you could see where the readers come from and where they go and so forth, and then you're watching at 3 in the morning, someone's coming from Shanghai or Dublin, or Berlin, what have you. And I tell people, Truthdig is Ramparts on speed. Without cutting a single tree or arguing with the Teamsters about delivering your publication or fighting to get somebody to put it up on their newsstand, you can reach millions of people. It's really quite spectacular. And I think we're not alone. So there's a wonderful energy on the internet, and I'm going to end on why I think all of this stuff is important for the survival of this internet. But at any rate, being in that world quite early on, I realized it's a two-edged sword, and which is why I got involved in considering all these issues. And because there were two things happening that I felt were quite alarming. One is the eagerness with which people gave up data about themselves very early on. And, of course, you know who you are and this and your age and blah, blah, blah. Not on the level where we are now, where you will give your fingerprint for your convenience and your location. I don't know, I must have given my location 8 times just to get here and to get to Macy's, my different apps, I had to tell them where I am. And so we all know that there's been this incredible voluntary submission of data of the kind that if a totalitarian regime, I say the internet is sort of the totalitarian, it's Hitler's wet dream, or Stalin's, or the Stasis, or what have you. Because the information you gathered in the old days, and I operated in quite a few totalitarian countries, you kind of had a sense when you were being followed, or you could figure out what they were doing. Somebody had to be on a street corner, or a phone had to be tapped, some letter had to be opened. I think when you compare, if you go watch, say, the very good documentary on the Stasi in East Germany, and you look at that primitive data collection, and you look at what people voluntarily turn over now, it's really quite striking. So that was one thing that intrigued me. The total loss of privacy on a voluntary activity, and the acceptance of a notion of freedom as being pretty much consumer sovereignty, the freedom to shop. And anything that aided that activity, very early on it felt, God, you'd give it all up. And the other thing was that you could do something with this data. Again, going to the old model of totalitarianism, people would, I've gotten my FBI files. There's a very nice judge, Cecil Poole, federal judge in the old days in San Francisco. He turned over a lot of my files to me. And, a lot of it was junk. And a lot of it wasn't stuff anybody ever read, and no one certainly could collate it, And now when you compare, for instance, in the Boston Marathon, that you could do comparison of 20 million facial images in a matter of hours, and and using the biometrics and all the other data and all the other. So the combination of the voluntary turning over of information and the existence of ever more powerful computer networks and clouds and everything to sift through and make all the correlations and get all this data is really the specter that we deal with. And so we know we're moving into a world that one could never have imagined, and we see it as Eric Schmidt, the CEO of one of longtime honchos, wrote a very interesting book over at Google, said they went through 350, his outrage the last few weeks over Snowden's revelation that they were tapping their main system. They go through 350 million people's private data to find 300 possible at-risk people. And they can do that. And we know the means of collecting that data. I'm sure there are people here who work in this industry, ever more refined, ever more extensive. And so whether it's little drone bugs or whatever, whether it's the biometrics, the white of your eyes, all the other things, it just makes any of the earlier alarms we had about an Orwellian world in which were being observed seem quite primitive. And the whole notion of whether we in fact can have a private life in any sense, a private space. People say get over it, right? Get over it, it's gone, it's over, and so forth. So let me then jump to why I think this is the most important subject we could be considering. And I'd like to just sort of sketch out some ideas about this. Hopefully I won't go on too long. And then come back, maybe have some discussion. You might have a different view. But I do think this is the ball game. And let me talk about just a little bit about the whole notion of democracy. It seems to me the efforts to have some kind of democratic decision-making, representative system, people being involved in their own making of their history, required two ingredients. It required an informed public, and it required a scale which this public could comprehend and act on. And our Constitution embodies those basic principles that you have, particularly in the Bill of Rights. You have a feeling of the essential assertion of the sovereignty of the individual. People note, for instance, our Constitution does not use the word privacy. But I think that privacy, what we mean by privacy, is implicit throughout the document. And if you consider, and particularly important, the Fourth Amendment, and what it establishes is the sovereignty of the individual. It goes back, as I'm sure you're quite familiar, I mean, you seem to be of the age where we actually learned something in school. There it was, 1600, and there was a decision that no, even the king couldn't come with his general warrants. Even the king had to acknowledge the sovereignty of the individual space, and thus was born really the basic idea of the Fourth Amendment, right? And so it goes back over 400 years. And the idea was that you must have some, in order for, just even under royalty, for society to be healthful, there has to be some notion of individual sovereignty, and it goes beyond mere consumer sovereignty. It goes beyond picking different color iPhones. It goes beyond just going into Best Buy and having new toys and so forth. It goes to being able to be alone with your thoughts, with your letters, with your possessions, to contemplate, to have conversations with your friends. to make errors, to try ideas out without it being under observation of the all-powerful king. And this became a particularly important notion for the people living in the colonies because the king was still observing, mostly in the form of tax collection. A lot of the original concern about sovereignty of the individual was the king was particularly, or the representative of the king, particularly interested in intruding on your activities so they could see how much they could tax you. They also wanted to make sure you weren't about to argue for breaking away from the king. And so it was a very clear idea as far as our founders, and that's why there is the Fourth Amendment. You're all familiar with the Fourth Amendment, right? Okay. I'm going to read it for you anyway, whether you want to or not. As was mentioned earlier, I teach, and so I have 500 students here, and I find there's a lot of things I think they know that they don't know. Because it's not going to be on the SATs. The Fourth Amendment is never on the SAT. So here, let me read it. It says, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon, and that's the key thing, no general warrant where the king's agents can come and just look for everything. No warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And that was considered incredibly important, restraint. And that, over the years, we came to expand that to modern technology, including wiretapping, and even it went from your domicile to the person, and what can be done to the person, and we know in criminal proceedings and everything else, that there's something inviolate about the individual. And one cannot talk about democracy of the kind that we have talked about or fantasized about without some notion of this sovereignty of the individual and where the individual thinks, resides, meets, and so forth. And it's important to refresh our understanding of that because never has this notion been so violated as in our current moment. Again, for the reasons I mentioned, the combination of a new technology, the ability to sift, and something else that I will talk about in a moment. So that was one key element, the idea of this private space. And it was tied to this other key element that I mentioned before of the informed citizen. And the citizen having some sense of their own sovereignty, their own power, their own ability to think, and the freedom to do so, to experiment, to read, and not to have someone looking over their shoulder, looking through their window, observing all that. And so those were the key ingredients. And it's interesting, when I was doing all this stuff originally at USC, I was writing a lot of columns, and one of the places I wrote where I did a cover story for a magazine, actually, that used to exist that Yahoo had called Yahoo Internet Life. And they did an issue on privacy. And I wrote that in 2000, did this whole thing, and talked about this emerging technology and so forth, and how alarming it was, and how much more invasive it was than anything, as I said, any dictator could ever imagine. And then what happened was, a year later, all of that was put on steroids because we had 9/11. And suddenly, all of this new technology could be used in a way that we never, until we read the Snowden thing, would imagine that this could be done, or that anyone was doing it. And after 9/11, we had a license, and the NSA, CIA, FBI, and local police have all interpreted they have a license to do anything in the name of making us more secure. Now, I just want to scotch that one argument that's always comes up. You know, we were attacked. We have enemies. We are at risk. And I find this argument, this whole line of argument, to be incredibly offensive. Because we have lectured the whole world about a very important point. Freedom is not a luxury that we have because we are secure. Freedom is essential to making us secure, right? This has been the whole basic idea. We have told people who said, no, in the interest of workers' rights, or in the interest of nationalist rights, or in the interest of Christ, or the interest of any goal they had, we have to suppress your freedom. And we always argued, no, if the ends are worthwhile, then the means have to be worthy. And we've always argued, no, freedom is not a luxury. Freedom is a means to be healthy. This is how bad ideas are driven out. We need debate. We need an informed public, right? And we've argued with this in the world with people, I know I did as a journalist, going around, who also had enemies, who also were under attack. You know, I argued this in the third world. I interviewed Fidel Castro in 1968. You know, had a lively exchange with the man over why freedom would make Cuba stronger rather than weaker. Didn't accept my argument at the time, but that was the sort of argument one had. I had an argument like that with family in North Vietnam. I had arguments like that in Egypt with people in the Nasser government. I had arguments like that with people in Israel after the Six-Day War. And as a journalist, and I'm sure some of you have traveled, or I don't know what you do for a living, but if you do this kind of work, you would have this argument all the time. People all over the world would say, you don't understand, we're in an insecure position here. We have enemies. And for that reason, we have to have the strong leader. You know, for that reason, we can't have the kind of freedom you're talking about. You're from this big, powerful country with this big military, but we're not. And you got that argument everywhere. You got it whether you were talking to Greeks about the Turks or Turks about the Greeks, or Protestants in Ireland, Catholics in Ireland. And people would always defend their excess, their stifling of freedom, their attacks physically on their enemy on the grounds that this was necessary to their survival as a society, to accomplishing their wonderful goals. And one can look around the world at the wreckage and say, no, because you used bad means, your goals became corrupted. Because you did not have a standard of freedom and respect for the individual and their rights to dissent and the need for free debate, you lost the idealism of your movement. You betrayed your revolution. This was the story of the last century. It didn't matter how worthy you thought your movement was if you did not respect the right of individuals to come to their conclusion, to make their own decision, to evaluate how it influenced them. You betrayed your revolution, your religion, your cause, your nation, or what have you. But they always had enemies, and they could always claim enemies. And we made the argument that freedom was not an indulgence that you had when you had no problems. No, freedom was the necessary ingredient to having a healthy society and dealing with your problems. Now, after 9/11, we forgot all that. We had what, by the standards of the world, was a rather minor disruption. It might offend people to say that. It was tragic. It was horrible. The suffering was real. It was quite dramatic. We had the pictures over and over again. But compared to, say, the U.S. Carpet bombing of Vietnam, and the napalming of whole areas, and the killing of all told 3.5 million people, according to McNamara, and yet I was in North Vietnam when it was bombed, and I was in the South, and I've been there, and so forth. We still said, no, better to be free, better to have dissent, better to have a multi-party system, better to have the protection of individual rights. And so, as I say, that's something that most of us were raised to believe, even though our own government quite often violated that. I don't have to give you that whole history, whether we go back to Native Americans or, up to, the incarceration of the Japanese. But the fact is, as an ideal, we held it strong. And then suddenly in 9/11, we had an attack that became a justification for throwing everything out the window. And my own feeling about that, I always ask people, what if that had been a primitive nuclear weapon in Manhattan, would we be a free society now? Or would we, I certainly would be dead or in jail. I don't know about you. But, what if we had the kind of chaos that can happen? And not 3,000, but 300,000, and loss of, your most important financial and business center and so forth. But nonetheless, 9/11 became the excuse. And if you look at the whole debate about Snowden and everything that was done, 9/11 became the excuse to throw away these basic standards of our freedom. And so I just want to develop this idea a little more of what is involved in this. And I think, in a way, it was a wake-up call for this community around here. Because they had been going along merrily with the idea of that data mining is just a great win-win thing, right? Maybe people don't understand. I don't know if any of you work for Google or anything, but I'm in the business of trying to make a living on the internet, and let me tell you, there aren't too many people who do journalism or provide content that make a living on the internet. The people who make a lot of money on the internet are not the New York Times, even though they've got a huge readership, or the Guardian now that has a big readership, or so forth. The reason journalism is in trouble is not because there aren't good stories to write about, or good journalists to write them, is that the business model got broke, right? And the thing, when I worked for the LA Times for 29 years, they were able to pay us and put out a pretty good newspaper. Why? Because they had an advertising base of auto ads, and the whole story. Well, the reality is now on the internet, we don't have a model for that favors the content providers. It doesn't exist. Whether the content providers do music, or they make movies, or they do news, or what have you. The big money that's made on the internet is made from people who can mine data, okay? That's the critical element here. Find out stuff about people, where are those eyeballs going, treat the whole world as a big focus group, do all the correlation of the data, then do the target advertising. That's why maybe you haven't noticed when you're watching a page and suddenly something pops up that recommends a restaurant like the one you just went to, or the movie you just went to, because of data mining. And I remember I learned the importance of this, and this I do go into in my book on the economy. I was in the 1990s, mid-90s, covering the reversal of Glass-Steagall. You're probably all familiar with that now. And this had to do with the merger of investment banking, commercial banking, insurance companies. And as a result, you were going to merge a massive amount of data, all right? And it would involve people's health, life expectancy, job experience, mortgages, all this data that Chase and Lehman and everybody had was now going to go into a big pot. And there were a few people at that time who sounded the alarm about what's happening, what's going to go on with this data. And they were an interesting group, bipartisan. One of them was William Southwire, who had been Nixon's speechwriter and had become a columnist at the New York Times and had a real concern about privacy. Another was a Republican senator from Alabama, Shelby. Another was Ed Markey, who just got elected to the Senate in Massachusetts, but was a congressman then, who was concerned about privacy. And what these people were arguing, and they were a small band, and they tried to convince Clinton that, first of all, this was some of them felt this was a lousy bill to begin with. Southwire was one of them, because it would allow too big to fail. But if you're going to sign this bloody bill, sign a provision on the data that insists on that the consumer agree to opt in, not opt out. You've all heard that language before. I have to go through it or no? We all know the distinction, right? Because we're in the Silicon Valley. Okay, and that was the really big distinction. The industries fought back like crazy and said, no, you do that, and then the whole merger, which is to get the data, and mine it will not pay off, because we would have to ask people, do you want us to give your data about your medical record to these other folks here who are selling you insurance, and to these other folks who might kick you off your insurance policy? And you want us to be able to do this. And instead of, and Clinton could have said, I'm not signing this bill unless there's opt-in, and you have to ask people this permission before you use this data and commingle it and sell to it and all that. And the industry said, no, just we'll do opt-out. They can investigate, and if they don't want to have this data done, and they've learned on their own that this data is being collected, they can write us a letter or appeal and ask us not to do it. Well, lots of luck with that. That'd be like asking the NSA not to share your data. But first you have to find out they have your data. And so it was a big distinction, opt-in and opt-out. And the lobbyists won the day, and we had no protection of data built in, and Clinton did not heed the concerns of the privacy folks about this, and as a result we had this massive merger of data. And I remember quite recently I had an experience with that. I was sitting at this Webby dinner, and with this kid, nice kid, I think he's 26, who had just sold Tumblr to Yahoo for $1.1 billion. And still wearing a sweater, nice. And I happened to have just written a column a couple of days before, and so now I'm a foot and a half away from him, and I said, hey, it's great that you're so rich suddenly, but one of the nice things about Tumblr is you weren't doing advertising, and you had the trust of all these folks and everything, but Yahoo's only buying you because they want to exploit this data, right? I mean, this is what they want. That's their business model. And he said, well, yeah, that's not so wonderful, but I'm sure we can work something out. And, and so there's a certain naivety to this. And interestingly enough, it extends to what Eric Schmidt saying in his new book. He finally gets it, but he didn't quite get it. Oh, shoot, I lost that part. I'll have to read it for you here. It's hard to read. But in his book that he wrote with, I forget the guy's name, who's the chief scientist or development guy, he says, quote, despite the expense, everything a regime would need to build an incredibly intimidating digital police state, including software that facilitates data mining and real-time monitoring of citizens, is commercially available right now. Companies that sell data mining software, surveillance, cameras, and their products will flourish. Their work with one government will flaunt their work with one government to attract new business. It's the digital analog to the arms sale. And then he goes on to say, with cloud computing, it takes just seconds to compare millions of faces. By indexing our biometrics signatures, some governments will try to track our every word and movement, both physically and digitally. That's a pretty stark warning from a guy who certainly knows how this is collected. But when he wrote it in his book, which came out in the spring, and I applauded that warning, it was some government somewhere else. There was no indication this could possibly be our government. And now, in the fall, we had just 4 days ago, in his interview with the Wall Street Journal, where the same Eric Schmidt said, God damn, our government. And we have to sue him, and it's frightening. And I don't know whether the Chronicle or any paper you look at, but the Washington Post, which broke this, they're still involved with the Snowden material, and they had wonderful charts showing just how vulnerable the whole architecture of Google was and how the NSA could swoop in and just get this massive amount of data. And it's no longer just the so-called metadata. No, they can get text, they can get everything. Photos, the whole deal. All your tastes, all your activities, anything they want, and so forth. So here's Eric Schmidt in just a matter of 6-7 months, who's seen, hey, it's not some government, out there, it's our government. And I think, I don't want to go on too long about this, but I think we have to recognize that we have become the bad guys in this. And then talk about what's at stake. Because up to now, our government has said, this is stuff the Chinese do, right? Or this is stuff the Russians do. Well, come on, they're rank amateurs. I mean, you know, this is what they're doing. It's kids' play. And what are the real consequences of this? Aside from the fact that a government can actually target people, stifle them, manipulate them, round them up, terrorize them, any government can do this. It also destroys what I would argue is the last chance we really have for a worldwide democratic experience. And I go back to the original idea I started with. In order for democracy on any level to work, there has to be an informed public, right? And there has to be the ability to act on this information. Otherwise, it's a hoax. Otherwise, it's people dipping their finger in purple and voting for the Ayatollah or somebody, you know, or for the party or this or that. And the internet, to my mind, represents that last great hope in obviously a globalized world. We're not going back to the village that Jefferson had in mind. You know, the founders had the idea that scale was everything. That's why they favored, you know, basically a state's protection and limited government and all that, and why they opposed empire very clearly, and why they believed it had to be kept on a level that you could comprehend. And they knew full well, as Washington warned in his farewell address, beware the impostures of pretended patriotism. They saw the example of Rome, they saw the example of Europe. If you expand too big, if you have an empire, truth will be the casualty. You will not have accountability, and you will be able to manipulate people, and you'll be able to terrorize them, and you'll ultimately make them your enemy. What the internet has promised for us is a possibility of reversing that. We can't reverse the global village. It's there. We can't reverse it. And we're not going to go back to small town America, and that's where the Tea Party stuff all seems a little bit crazy. It's not going to happen. You're not going to go back to it, if that's even what you give you the benefit, that's what you want. So we're going to live in a world with multinational corporations, multinational banking, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And then the question is whether we can communicate, whether we can really know what's going on out in that world, and who are these people, and why do they do what they do, and do they know who we are, and do we have a complex relationship of human beings, and so forth. And the web was holding out that, does hold out that possibility. You can read an article from China and instantly translate it. And you can find out what newspapers here may be dying, but you can read journals from all over the world, and you can read what their experts say, and you can get a contrarian view. And we've all experienced that. In fact, we wouldn't even really be having Snowden if The Guardian hadn't stepped up, and if we all didn't have instant access to The Guardian, a rather small English paper. So this is the great hope of the internet, that maybe we actually can live in a fairly sane world, you know, a global village, okay? Well, what is the basic consequence of this misbehavior? And I don't blame the whistleblowers. They didn't do the misbehaving. The misbehaving would come out anyway. And I'll end with a comment on that. The misbehaving would come out. But what does this misbehaving do? It means, what is this great defense? Everybody does it. You know, what does that mean? It's right? It's what the little kids say. You know, everybody does it. Is that the gold standard? And the fact is, and we have been entrusted, it's like the currency issue. We've been entrusted with this thing called the dollar. You know, if we misuse it and people reject it, and they want to balkanize currency more than it is, and we don't have international standards for commerce and acceptance and fluidity and so forth, we have trouble. Well, the same thing is true with information and with the internet. And what we have done is given license to people all over the world who want to put walls up, want to prevent their own people from getting another point of view. getting other information. And we're saying, and giving them the argument, hey, you can't trust. The internet is nothing but an American toy that their government uses, and these companies that claim to be multinational in a good sense really are not. They're extensions of national U.S. power. And it extends to the talking points of the Secretary General of the UN, right? When he goes in to see Barack Obama, you saw that story, and Barack Obama has already got his talking points before the guy starts talking, because his cell phone and his papers and everything have been bugged, okay? And so folks in Brazil, but also folks in Germany, folks all over, and it's not obviously just national security, it's been conceded as commercial data, it's, you know, all sorts of things. It's their political issues and what have you. And so what you're really doing is destroying this great possibility for communication. And you're saying it's something that is subject to national interests. It's something that we can use to have an advantage over everyone else. And the only way you can deal with it is to play the same game. You spy on us, you break it up, and you put up big walls, and you keep us out of your thing, and we're into balkanization. It's extremely dangerous, it's very costly, and as I say, it trashes, you know, it's difficult enough to try to have some decency in this modern, complex world. It destroys the last best hope. Now, I just want to end by bringing up a local anecdote by way of answering this question of, well, we need secrets, and these people have weakened us, and this is about Bradley Manning. And so I remember when it was said about Ellsberg, you know, in the Pentagon Papers, now Ellsberg is so, everybody says, well, too bad Snowden isn't another Ellsberg. Well, why the hell isn't he? You know, they did the same thing. I mean, Ellsberg saw material on the screen. I just got an email from Ellsberg, you know. He's still at it. And what did Ellsberg do? Ellsberg saw material that the American public had a right to read. The world public had a right to see, right? This is information you needed to have if you're going to make informed decisions, right? And the reality is that when it comes to foreign policy in particular, but international economic policy, we basically don't have the information to make intelligent decisions. We had a wonderful example of it with 60 Minutes, you know, admitting they got hoodwinked. Now, how did they get hoodwinked? Because some guy who has access to classified data, he used it for his own purpose, right? Wrote a book and so forth about what happened in Libya, and now they have egg on their face because he wasn't there when this happened, and so forth and so on, had told the FBI. Well, if this information had been made public from the beginning, they would not be so vulnerable. But the reality is, when it comes to most matters of national security, and a good deal to do with very important issues about international commerce and everything else, most of the data is obtained by the mass media by leaks. Leaks, okay? Only they're not the kind of leaks you get from a Bradley Manning or a Daniel Ellsberg or an Edward Snowden, which are uncomfortable to people in power. They're the leaks that support one faction or other in power or the main power. And so the standard, you know, for instance, the person who talked to 60 Minutes, he's revealing information that's supposedly secret, you know, and the people contradicting his information who talked to the New York Times that had the story exposed, presumably they're leaking information. And in my 29 years at the LA Times, didn't happen quite so much when I was at Ramparts, but in my 29 years at the LA Times, people would tell me things all the time that they weren't supposed to be telling me. That's the norm, not the exception. That's that's the conveyor belt of most news. It's off the record, or, you know, not for attribution, so on and so forth. And there's a whole code about how you do it. And I just want to give one example. I may have used it some other time, but I don't mind repeating myself. I was up here. I was in the arms control group that Sid Drell had at Stanford. I don't know if he's still there, I don't think, at Galvez House. And I used to come up here from L.A. and fly into San Jose, rent a car, and go there and sit around, talk to Condoleezza Rice, and Sidrell and other people around this thing. And so I get on a plane, I think it was PSA then, not Southwest, in LA. And anyway, when I'm getting off the plane, I run into Edward Teller. You all remember Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb. And actually was a pretty nice guy, very accessible. And so he said, hey, how you doing? And, because I had interviewed him a bunch of times. And I said, oh, I'm going up to the arms control unit there at Galvez. I says, oh, great. He says, make sure Sid tells you about the great results we just had on the cottage test. Okay? And I looked at him, I said, what do you mean? He said, this all had to do with the X-ray laser. Do you remember the X-ray laser, the thing that got Reagan to do Star Wars? And there was going to be this great nuclear explosion in the heavens and would shoot out all these infinite rays and kill all the incoming missiles and so forth. And so, but you had to show that this nuclear explosion would create all these Buck Roger lasers, okay? And so Edward Teller was a big fan of this technology. It was going to be a breakthrough, very excited about it. He convinced Reagan it was working, and only trouble was it wasn't working. So they had this test. Now, the idea that they were called, and they were named after different cheeses at that time, but that was supposed to be a secret. You weren't supposed to know that what they were testing, right? It was the cottage test. And you certainly weren't supposed to know the results. And if they had, in fact, gotten lasing from this nuclear explosion, they would have harnessed the power of a nuclear explosion to make the most frightening military weapon, or defensive weapon, depending on your point of view, ever imagined. So this was, at that moment, if it had happened, even the fact if it didn't happen, what happened at that test was the most important military secret you could have in this country. Nothing could have been more important. There wasn't anything the Soviets would rather know about than that. If, in fact, the cottage test done by Livermore had produced that effect. And here's Edward Teller, kind of a chipper way, make sure Sid tells you about this. We had great results. I said, oh, you got lasing? Yeah, it's great. He was all excited about it. Not mocking the man, but that's what he was like. So I get up to Stanford, and thought about it today. I was like, got lost a bunch of times up there. And I go into Galvez's house, and Sidrell was a great scientist, and he was a member of the group that had the highest clearance and was involved in a lot of stuff. And I said, hey, I saw Teller down here at the airport, and he says, you're going to tell me all about the cottage test and the great results they got on lasing. Well, Sidrell turns white. He was a Jason, you the pledge, you don't talk to anybody. And he says, what are you talking outside? And he takes me outside. I said, what are you talking about? He says, some kind of, I said, no, Edward Teller. He says, I don't talk about that. You can't talk about it. He says, and he was a hell of a nice guy. And very decent and very brilliant, a truly brilliant person, and everything. And I only offer that as an example. Anyway, it turns out, by the way, that they didn't get lasing, that the instruments had been affected by the explosion, and that this was a hoax. And I don't know what time they told Reagan, but it only came out much later that, in fact, how the story had evolved. Reagan thought they were making great progress. They weren't. So they didn't have the Buck Rogers weapon. There wasn't going to be Star Wars defense and so forth. But I only offer that to say not that this was such a strange, weird thing to happen. It was the norm. And if anyone's honest about it, who covers this stuff, I'll give you another example, just one more, because it's similar to this one. James Risen is now, of the New York Times, is in trouble because he talked about something happened and they go after him. Well, Risen wrote an article for the New York Times with another reporter, Jeff Girth, and it was about the theft of nuclear secrets from Los Alamos. Do you remember that story? And it was about how the Chinese, presumably, had stolen the crown jewels of America's nuclear program. Now, that story was based on leaks that came from a Congressman, Christopher Cox, who used to represent Irvine, then went on to be head of the Securities and Exchange Commission during the time when the economy exploded. Anyway, and it involved some people in the Department of Energy, and they were trying to embarrass Clinton, and then it turned out that the supposed theft of the crown jewels would have happened under Reagan, so it wasn't as a good story for them. But as a result, this fellow Wen-Ho Lee, scientist at Los Alamos, gets caught up in this net, and even though he's from Taiwan, even though he's come to this country to help freedom, even though he doesn't like mainland China because he likes Italian opera and can't stand Chinese opera and so forth, and doesn't work out at all, and he somehow ends up being the villain, and these New York Times stories, which they then have to apologize for later, basically convict him before he's even arrested, and he gets arrested. He's held in solitary for 9 months under a light. Every time he goes to the bathroom, it's videotaped and everything else in an attempt to crack this guy. And at the end of the day, and I happened to be in Albuquerque when it happened, this Reagan-appointed judge, federal judge, after sifting through all of this stuff, after all this whole thing, says, Mr. Lee, your government and this court and the Congress owe you an apology for this thing. And in fact, and they have this little tiny plea on some technicality of using the material as a doorstopper, and the whole thing goes away, okay? All of that was based on leaked information. Other papers picked it up, TV picked it up. All of it was based on leak, again, of the highest security, okay? So the takeaway then is they're not upset about the leaking. The leaking goes on all the time. Classification means nothing. Every single scrap of paper is classified, okay? But what Snowden did and what Manning did and Julian Assange abetted and all of this stuff is to let us in, not on stuff that is secret, because it's all supposed to be secret, but stuff that's embarrassing. Embarrassing. Because the fact of the matter is, if this is a good thing to do, you should say it. And you should tell us. The CIA should tell us they've got AT&T doing all this stuff. We just learned, yesterday. And what is happening, and people complain about, the trickle effect, the torture, water dropping and so forth. It's massive. It's the biggest scandal, I would argue, in American history. And it's the biggest scandal because it's so alarming. It means, in fact, that this very thing that the founders thought was at the center of our experience, the sovereignty of the individual, can no longer be assumed. They're no longer, they can be maintained. That we're all being observed at every moment of our lives. We have absolutely no private space. We have no ability to protect ourselves from overwhelming government power, commercial power. They seem to be the same, right? And then, finally, where does that leave the individual knowing that? I mean, what does that do to our interpersonal relations? What does that do with your willingness to read certain books? Well, if you know, for instance, maybe I'd like to read Mein Kampf. What was that guy Hitler all about anyway, right? Right? Well, maybe I'll read Henry Miller, D.H. Lawrence, Lady Chatterley's Lover. Will somebody know that I'm really a pornographer at heart? And the whole thing that the founders had in mind, the development of the individual through trial and error, personal time, writing your diary, reading your books, right? The sovereignty of the individual, okay, that goes out the door. And what you have now, and I think, and I see this with my students who are really good people, but they are quite willing to sacrifice this. Most people I talk to say, okay, so what? And the so what is really something that has to be answered. Because if you can't have this private space to develop, then you do become one of the people that Orwell described, You do become, the outer person only, because there's no place for the inner. You'll be observed. And you better not have the thoughts of the inner person. You better suppress them. you know. And it's really of great consequence. And I don't understand why more people are not alarmed about it. And my only answer is, in fact, and the answer I get all the time, well, I wouldn't do any of those things. You know, I get it all the time. Well, Bob, you know, sure, you were watched by the FBI. You were the editor of Ramparts. Well, our system is supposedly built on people willing to be the editor of Ramparts. That's why we have a free press. You don't need a free press guarantee. They're all going to write the same stuff. You know, if there's not anyone going to go out on a limb and challenge things and think a little differently, you know, question, right? And that argument seems to carry the day. You know, don't do it. Don't have those thoughts. Don't read that book. Don't talk to anybody who knows Arabic. Okay? Don't eat any Arabic food. You know, I mean, really, there's a thing being put out there. And when it's put out there, and then you say to people, well, then you still think you're free? You know, you think you're free? Yes. And it turns out by freedom they mean how I wasted my afternoon today. I had time on my hands, and I couldn't find a bookstore. Now, I'm sure they exist. I mean, I know they still do. But I couldn't find one. And I found, I don't know how many Starbucks, but, you know, okay. And there's Choice, and there's even a Pete's. There's a number of Best Buys, you know, even found a men's Macy's and a female Macy's, and very nice, you know, and everything. And basically, I spent, because I had to arrive here at 12 o'clock to do the show, I spent the last 6 hours in a mindless exercise of consumerism. Absolutely mindless. There was nothing else to do in this very sophisticated, I'm sure there is, you know, I'm sure there are concerts to go to and books to read and lectures and so forth, but somehow it didn't present itself in this life here, you know. And so if in fact consumer sovereignty, and there was a great professor at Stanford when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, he used to go back and forth to the two departments, Tibor Skatovsky, and he used to teach about consumer sovereignty. He's the first person that alerted me to it. If that becomes your definition of freedom, you basically have destroyed any hope of a meaningful use of that term, right? If that's what you mean, and unfortunately, many people in our society now define their freedom as the ability to get the next version of that software, or get this toy or that toy, or so forth. And I would just remind people that the consequences are truly alarming. Truly alarming, because if you have an uninformed public, you have a public that in times of stress, and I do think as we move into this more complex, challenging world and failed expectations and so forth, you have the ingredients of profound instability in a society. And so I'll just conclude on that, and then we'll have time for questions. Yeah. Okay.